7 families moved into that house. 7 families left running, some in the middle of the night, without even folding their clothes properly, without even looking back, without even closing the door behind them. But she walked in, opened the windows one by one, breathed the stagnant air that rushed out from inside like someone releasing a prisoner kept away for a long time, and said to herself quietly but with all the firmness she had that she was going to stay. Have you ever arrived at a place so broken down, so heavy with untold history, that the whole world told you to leave, and even so you felt a strange thing in your chest that felt like belonging? Can you imagine looking at peeling walls, windows boarded up with planks, a roof that cries in the rain, and a backyard that has turned into thick weeds, and seeing not a problem, but the most beautiful possibility that life has ever placed in front of you? This happened in May of 1931, in a small countryside town in Kentucky called Silent Valley. But before getting into this story that will warm your heart, tell me something. Where are you watching this video from right now? Write your city, your state, right here in the comments. I love knowing where the folks who follow the Tales of Yesteryear channel come from. And if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now and turn on the little bell so you do not miss any new stories. You can leave a thumbs up too. That helps the channel grow a lot and bring more stories like this to more people. Come with me, because this one is worth every minute. Beatrice Sampson was 27 years old when she arrived in Silent Valley, and she carried in her worn leather suitcase much less than what was necessary and much more than she imagined. The suitcase itself held very little. 3 dark cotton dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, where one had been begging for repairs for a long time, and the other was of thicker leather that she used for work. A grey wool cardigan that had belonged to her father and that still smelled faintly of the tobacco he smoked on Sundays. A complete sewing kit that she treated as if it were jewelry, because in a way it was. And at the bottom of the suitcase, folded with that care of someone folding something that cannot be creased, a portrait of her father that she could not leave behind, even knowing it would make everything harder to carry. What she brought that could not fit in any suitcase was exhaustion, not the exhaustion of a bad afternoon, nor of a heavy week, nor the kind that fades with a good night of sleep. It was that deep exhaustion that settles into the bones of those who have spent entire years living just to survive, without ever stopping to ask if this was what they wanted for their own life, if there was anything beyond the day-to-day that would remain as a legacy when the day-to-day ended. Beatrice had left Louisville 7 days earlier with a bus ticket bought with the money left over after paying the last rent bills and the petty debts her father had unintentionally left behind. Arthur Sampson was too good a man to be a businessman, and when illness knocked on his door, it knocked with all its strength and without any consideration. 3 years of coming and going to the doctor, 3 years of expensive medicine, 3 years of Beatrice taking every sewing job that appeared in front of her, whether it was a wedding dress with a veil and train, a hem on a factory worker's trousers, or mending a bedsheet torn at the elbow, whatever it was, anything that arrived with a needle and thread within the price. She learned to sew from her mother, who had died too early to teach everything she knew. Her mother had fingers that danced with the needle. That was the way her father described it. Fingers that danced, as if the thread knew where to go before the hand decided. Beatrice inherited the fingers and the instinct, but she learned the technique on her own, with that stubbornness of someone who has no other option and therefore perfects herself more than any school would teach. She kept her thimble, needle and thread organized in the kit with an order that was almost military, and hands that were fast and precise in a way that only comes from many years of practice and honest attention to one's own work. In Louisville, she worked for an older seamstress named Mrs. Eunice, who had a studio on a narrow street in the historic district with a hand-painted wooden sign on the door and a permanent smell of new fabric and steam from a pressing iron. Mrs. Eunice was a woman of few words, but of consistent recognition, which was the kind of boss that is worth gold, the one who does not praise but who trusts the work you do, and the presence of that is more than any speech. It was a good life within what was possible. Small, organized, honest, and then her father was slowly dying, like someone who does not want to cause trouble, like someone who is apologizing for each passing day with more difficulty than the previous one. And Beatrice was slowly ending up alone, so slowly that she almost did not notice until the day she noticed it all at once, with all the force of the thing, in the silence of the boarding house room after the funeral, with her open suitcase on the bed and her father's portrait in her hand, and no noise coming from the adjacent room where he had slept for 3 years while falling ill. Staying in Louisville was possible. There was work. There was Mrs. Eunice. There was Mrs. Higgins's boarding house, which charged a fair rate. But possible was not the same as right, and Beatrice always knew how to distinguish the two things with that clarity of someone who learned early on that confusing possible with right is the origin of many a life that could have been different. To stay would mean the same shrunken life she had lived up to that point. It would mean continuing to exist in the small size that circumstances had determined, without ever asking herself if there was a larger size that fit her. She spent 2 weeks alone in the boarding house room after her father's death, and in those 2 weeks something slowly took shape, without rush, but without wavering. She wanted a place of her own, not rented, not borrowed, not as a favor from anyone. A place where she could hammer a nail into the wall without asking permission, plant something in the yard and wait for it to grow for her, wake up in the morning and hear the sound of the woods and the birds instead of the sound of streetcars and neighbors. She wanted ground, she wanted walls, she wanted a door with a key that was hers and no one else's. The problem was the money, which was little, but was not nothing. Louisville was out of the question to buy anything worth living in, but Constance, a seamstress who had worked with her and who had moved away to the countryside 2 years prior, had sent a letter telling of small towns where land and a house still cost what a poor person could manage to pay without killing themselves. Beatrice did not go to where Constance was. She did not go to where anyone else she knew was, because leaving toward the familiar was leaving halfway, and she wanted to truly leave. She boarded a bus, heading to the southern part of the state, carrying her leather suitcase, and that combination of courage and uncertainty that is the only honest baggage of someone starting over. She changed buses in a roadside town, and on the dashboard of the second bus there was a list of destinations on yellowed cardboard, and among the names she read Silent Valley with something that was not recognition because she had never heard the name before, but that had the texture of recognition, a strange sensation, almost physical, that she belonged there. It was not logical. She knew it was not logical, but that is how it was. The bus left her in a dirt town square in the late afternoon of a Tuesday in May of 1931. Beatrice stepped down carrying her suitcase, adjusted her father's cardigan over her shoulders because the late afternoon air already carried that delicious chill of the Kentucky countryside that Louisville did not know how to make, and she stood still for a moment, just looking. Silent Valley was a town that looked like it was in no hurry to grow up and saw no problem at all in that. The central square had a little stone church with a low belfry and a bronze bell that Beatrice would later learn rang at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening with that punctuality that is a comfort of a small town. There was a wooden bandstand painted white, with the paint peeling at the edges in a way that was not neglect, but was history. Around the square, colonial-style houses with narrow cobblestone sidewalks, a few establishments with that specific look of rural commerce that had existed for decades and felt no need to update. A general store with sacks of flour at the entrance, a barber shop with a leather chair and an oval mirror, a pharmacy with its door painted dark green, and a boarding house on one of the corners with a handwritten wooden sign that simply said, "Boarding House, Rooms Available." The smell of the square was of wet earth from recent rain, mixed with wood smoke from a nearby kitchen, and a touch of honeysuckle from a plant that must be blooming nearby. The sycamore trees that lined the square cast that generous late afternoon shadow that only old trees know how to make, a shadow that is not cold but is relieved, the shadow that invites. A yellow dog slept under the bandstand with its paws crossed, as if it owned the place. 3 men conversed in front of the general store with that calm of those who have all the time in the world. Beatrice walked toward the boarding house carrying her suitcase, and that feeling again, stronger than on the bus, more real than any logical thought on the subject. The feeling that the place had been waiting for someone, and she had arrived. She shook her head at herself because that kind of thinking did not pay any bills, and knocked on the door. The owner of the boarding house was named Rose Albright, but everyone in Silent Valley called her Mrs. Rose, which was the only name that suited her. She was a woman of 50 years with a round and generous face, hair that was already completely white and tied in a bun that sat slightly crooked to the left side during the day, and she had the kind of smile that looks genuine because it is genuinely so, without effort and without performance. The kind that makes the whole face participate. She was sweeping the entrance when Beatrice arrived, raised her eyes from the broom, evaluated the newcomer with that calm expertise of someone who receives people all year round and already knows how to read what a person brings before they open their mouth, and said that she had a room available in the back with a window facing the yard, which cost $2 a week, including breakfast. Beatrice asked if there was a place to eat nearby. Mrs. Rose pointed to her own kitchen with her thumb in a casual manner and said that she sold a hot plate of food for a fair price to anyone who needed it, that she did not like to see a person go without eating. It was a gentle lie from a good person because the price was more than fair. Beatrice accepted with the same spirit of someone who recognizes kindness without making a fuss, and thus began the friendship between the two of them, with the direct simplicity of things that last. In the back room, with the good smell of clean sheets washed with white laundry soap and a window whose panes were so clean they seemed not to exist, Beatrice unpacked her suitcase with that methodicalness that was her way for everything. Dresses on the hanger, shoes underneath, sewing kit on the shelf, her father's cardigan folded on the chair, and her father's portrait on the nightstand, leaning against the white lime wall. Arthur Sampson had clear eyes and a calm demeanor in the portrait. He was wearing a suit on a day that Beatrice did not exactly remember which it was, with the slightly reticent smile of someone who was not used to posing for photographs. Beatrice ran her finger over the simple wooden frame and said to him without words, only with that internal understanding of someone who speaks to someone who is gone, that she was going to be fine, that she was going to find a way, that she always found a way, that he knew that. Then she lay down on the spring bed that squeaked a little, caught the scent of mint and basil coming from the backyard through the window, and slept the deep sleep of someone who had travelled far and arrived where she was going without knowing she was going there. The next morning, after coffee and warm buttermilk biscuits that Mrs. Rose brought on a tray with that care of a person who knows that a hot meal in the morning is a gesture of hospitality that is worth more than any speech, Beatrice arranged her hair in her usual firm bun, put on her thicker leather shoes, tucked her money into the inside pocket of her coat, and went straight to the county clerk's office. The county clerk's office was located in a corner house with a brass plaque on the outside wall, and it smelled of the paper and ink of a public department that is the same smell in any town in the country. Mr. Bennett was the clerk, a thin man with round glasses with thick lenses, who seemed to carry the bureaucratic weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He listened to Beatrice with the expression of someone who has heard a similar request hundreds of times and who already knows the end of the story before the story finishes. She explained in a direct manner. She had little money, but was hard-working and honest, intended to settle in the town, and wanted to buy a property. Mr. Bennet opened the large book with a worn spine that lay on his desk, turned the pages with his index finger in a clearly automatic ritual, muttered to himself a few things she did not catch, closed the book, took off his glasses, cleaned them with the handkerchief from his suit pocket, and looked at her with an expression that was hard to read, a mix of cautious respect with something that looked like a decision being made. "There is a house available," he said after a moment. "Large, good location, solid structure. The price is within what you mentioned, with plenty to spare." Beatrice waited for the but, because there was a but coming with that certainty of someone who has read the entire sentence before it is spoken. "It is the Sycamore House," continued Mr. Bennet, with his voice a tone lower, in that specific way when one speaks of a delicate subject. "It is at the end of Cedar Street, at the north exit of the town. In the last 20 years, 7 families have lived there. None stayed more than 2-3 months. Beatrice calmly asked why. Mr. Bennet folded his glasses and placed them on the book before answering. "People say things," he said, choosing each word carefully. "Noises at night that cannot be explained, a shadow that appears in a window when no one is there, a door that opens by itself. I personally do not believe much in those stories. It is not my way. But the verifiable fact is that nobody stays. The last family left 4 years ago, and since then there has not been a single resident. Nobody has even wanted to look over the fence." Beatrice asked the price. Mr. Bennet stated the value with an expression of someone who hoped the value would be the final argument she needed to walk away. She did the math in her head, verified it, did it again. It was enough to buy the house and still have money left over for the first few months. She was silent for a moment, not out of doubt, but that silence of someone who is putting the pieces in the right place before speaking. "Can you take me to see it today?" she asked. Mr. Bennet opened his mouth, closed his mouth. Then he said he could, that they could go right now if she wanted to. The two of them walked down the main street, then turned onto a cobblestone side street, then another, and the town gradually faded behind them. The houses became more spaced out, the yards larger and more wooded, the sidewalks disappearing into packed dirt, the noise of the square becoming distant and soft. Cedar Street began where the cobblestones ended completely, and the packed dirt took over, wide and red, with sycamore trees planted on both sides that grew toward each other, creating a corridor of dark green shade that the afternoon crossed in streaks. There was a silence on that street, in a way that was different from the silence of the rest of the town. It was more complete. It was the kind of silence that has texture. The Sycamore House was at the end of the corridor, where the street made a slight curve and opened into a wider area. Beatrice stopped a few yards before and stood looking. It was a 2-story building, which already made it larger than anything she had lived in her entire life. The plaster walls were peeling in several places, revealing the brick and mortar beneath with that irregular pattern that looks like a drawing when you look closely. But the walls themselves were thick, built in that old and honest way that lasted longer than the generation that built them. The slate shingle roof had some broken pieces on the left side where a gutter had dislodged, and the resulting leak had left a dark stain running down the wall like an old, dry tear. The upstairs windows were boarded up with dark wooden planks, which gave the facade that appearance of closed eyes, of a thing that had been protected from the inside but was waiting from the outside. The main door, made of solid wood that even peeled and worn, showed its quality, had its paint so consumed by time that one could barely tell what the original color had been, although a better preserved fragment on an upper frieze suggested something that could have been dark green. The front yard was overgrown with weeds in an advanced stage, with crabgrass, ferns, and some climbing vines that had advanced along the stone path, right up to the doorstep, as if taking what they felt belonged to them. A sycamore tree, larger than all the others on the street, grew in the left corner of the yard, with that presence of an old tree that is almost an authority. And it cast a shadow that covered almost half of the facade of the house, in a protection that could be described as maternal, depending on the mood of the beholder. Mr. Bennet stood next to Beatrice, waiting for the reaction that he imagined would be a retreat. Beatrice's reaction was to walk through the rusted iron gate that squeaked on its hinge, with that squeak of a tool begging for attention, walk through the weeds, stepping firmly up to the door, and stand still with her open hand on the rough wood for a moment. She felt that thing again, that recognition that was not logical, but that was absolutely real, more real in that second than anything she had planned over the week, as if the house also recognized her. Mr. Bennet found the key in his suit pocket, inserted it into the old lock that protested with that squeak of a mechanism that had not been operated in a long time, and the door opened with a heavy sigh. The smell that wafted out was of stagnant air, accumulated layers of dust, dry wood that had lost its varnish, and an undertone of something resembling sweet fennel, perhaps from a plant that had grown through a crack and left its perfume even after drying out. Beatrice walked in. The entrance hallway was wide enough for two people to pass, facing forward without bumping into each other, which was an architectural generosity for the standard of 1931 in the countryside. It opened into a large living room on the left, with a stone fireplace in the corner, and when Beatrice saw that fireplace, she stopped for a second, with an expression that Mr. Bennet would later describe to his wife as that of someone who saw a thing they had been looking for without knowing it. The wooden floor was thick with dust and had some boards lifted at the edges, but it was a solid hardwood floor, dark and dense, the kind that when you scrape a little corner with your boot, it reveals a shine that was waiting down there. The kitchen was in the back, with a large window looking out onto the backyard, which was larger than the front one, and had in its corner an old apple tree with a wide trunk that had grown without anyone pruning it for many years. What lay in the rest of the backyard appeared to be the ruins of a vegetable garden that was once deeply cared for, with planting beds outlined by stones that could still be seen under the weeds, and that dark soil of a place that has received much compost and much water, and that retains the habit of producing. The cast-iron wood stove was rusted but standing, with that solidity of cast iron that does not break, it only needs care. Beatrice climbed the stairs. The solid wood banister carved with leaves and branches in bas relief made her stop for a second, running her fingers over the carvings, because it was the work of someone who had patience and pride, work made to be seen and touched, and there was something about the fact that this existed in a house that was abandoned, that was simultaneously sad and hopeful. Upstairs, there were two large bedrooms and a smaller one, all with boarded-up windows. The air was almost thick from standing still. Beatrice walked over to the first boarded-up window in the largest bedroom, evaluated the planks with the eye of someone who is used to solving things with what she has, found a piece of iron in the corner that must have been a hinge for something that no longer existed, used it as a lever, and the plank came loose with a dry and clean sound that held the satisfaction of the right thing being done. The window opened to the May afternoon. The light flooded in all at once, golden and generous, which is the color of the late afternoon light in the Kentucky countryside that has no equal, illuminating the dust that flew in swirls that the afternoon pierced through as if they were suspended gold. Outside, there were the sycamore trees of the street, the low roofs of the town's large houses in the background, a patch of blue sky with a stationary white cloud, and the sound of a bird that was in the tree in the yard and that did not get scared by the window opening, which Beatrice would later think was the first good sign. Beatrice stood with her hands flat on the window frame and breathed the outside air that came in smelling of earth and sycamore. It was a simple moment, but it was the kind of moment that leaves a mark in a way that does not fade. She felt a thing in her chest that had taken a long time to arrive. Hope. Not the restless and tense hope of when you want something desperately. The other kind. The quiet hope of someone who recognizes they have arrived where they were supposed to be. "I am going to stay," she said to the air in the room, in a low but clear voice. Mr. Bennet, who had climbed up behind her and was standing at the door with his glasses slipped down his nose, asked if she was sure. 7 families, he said, as if that number had its own weight. Beatrice kept her eyes on the open window. "I heard what you said about the 7 families," she answered, "but I did not come here to be the 8th that leaves. I came to be the first that stays." Mr. Bennet stayed quiet for a moment that was one of genuine thought. Then he nodded his head in a slow gesture that seemed more for himself than for her, as if he were agreeing with something he had thought but not said, and stated that he was going to prepare the paperwork for the next day. Beatrice asked to stay a little longer alone. He went downstairs. She spent more than an hour in that house after Mr. Bennet waited on the street down below. She walked through each room with the specific attention of someone who is making an inventory of possibilities, not problems. The roof with the broken shingles needed repair before the rains got heavy. The lifted floorboards were a matter of patience and new nails. The boarded-up windows were protection against the weather, not a haunting. The fireplace was solid and just needed the flue cleaned. The vegetable garden in the back only needed weeding and someone willing to work. Beatrice was very willing to work. That had never been a problem at any point in her life. She walked down the stairs, running her hand over the carved banister, went out the door, leaving it purposely open, letting the afternoon air circulate inside, crossed the weeds in the front yard, closed the gate which squeaked again, and returned to Mrs. Rose's boarding house with her head full of plans organized by order of urgency. That night, in the back room with the window open to the mint garden, Beatrice wrote down on a sheet of paper all the things that needed to be done at the Sycamore house, in order of urgency, with a cost estimate next to each item. The list had 12 points. She looked at it, added 2 more she had forgotten. She tucked it away in the sewing kit where she kept important things. Then she lay down, looked at the wooden ceiling of the boarding house, and slept a sleep she had not slept in months. Deep, without interruption, in that way the body only achieves when it has finally stopped being on alert. The next morning she signed the papers at Mr. Bennet's desk, who observed her throughout the whole process with that expression of cautious respect of someone who still does not know if he is looking at courage or recklessness, and who thinks it is probably both. At the end, he handed her the key. It was a heavy old iron key, the size of 3 fingers together, with that texture of metal that has worked hard for many years. When Beatrice closed her hand around it, she felt its weight as a good thing, as a right thing. Before leaving the clerk's office, she asked for a recommendation for someone who did carpentry work in the town. Mr. Bennet answered without hesitation that it was Lucas Moretti. Carpentry shop on Rose Street next to the pharmacy. Good work, honest price. Beatrice noted the name in her memory and went to the house. The first day of work at the Sycamore house was of brute cleaning, the kind that has no shortcuts. Beatrice arrived early in the morning with a new broom bought at the general store, 2 floor rags, a wooden bucket bound in iron, a bar of soap, and the specific determination of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. She opened the main door, stood still for a moment at the entrance, letting the morning air circulate inside, smelled the scent of closed space begin to mix with the fresh air from outside, and then rolled up the sleeves of her work dress and began. Sweeping that living room was a job of more than 2 hours. The dust was thick and heavy, the kind that settles in layers during years of abandonment. each family that had passed, leaving their parting contribution. Beatrice swept with the systematic patience that was her way for any work, from the inside out, from left to right, in overlapping passes that left no area uncovered. The sound of the broom on the wooden floor had that rhythm of honest work that is almost musical when you fall into the beat. When the living room was clean enough for the next step, she moved to the hallway, then to the kitchen, then to the stairs, then to the upstairs bedrooms. In the middle of the afternoon, with her dress covered in dust that had turned an undefined color between the black of the fabric and the gray of the accumulation, her hair escaping her bun in every direction, and her hands red from scrubbing, Beatrice was on her knees on the living room floor, running a damp rag over the boards. The wood, underneath all that dirt, was beautiful, dark, dense, with that muted shine that good wood has when it is of high quality. It was exactly in this state, on her knees on the large living room floor, her hair dishevelled with strands in front, her dress dusty, a rag in her hand, and a bucket of dark water next to her, that Beatrice heard footsteps stopping at the main door, and a voice. It was a man's voice, calm and slightly cautious, which said he was looking for the owner of the house because a fellow at the general store had mentioned that the new resident of the Sycamore house might need carpentry services. Beatrice stood up, fixed her hair as much as was possible, which was not much, wiped her hands on the rag, and turned toward the door. At the entrance of the living room, leaning against the door frame with a politeness that was not shyness, but was the respect of someone who understands that entering someone's house uninvited is crossing a line, stood a man of about 30 years, dark-haired, with dark eyes that had that specific way of truly paying attention when they looked at something, that way of total presence that some people have and that the majority do not. He wore a plaid flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow, older denim work pants, and had the hands of someone who works with wood, the fingers a little thicker at the joints, the palms with tool marks that do not come off with soap. That firmness of someone who holds a handsaw and a plane frequently enough for the muscles to reshape themselves around the trade. He held his cap with both thumbs on the brim, and on his face was an expression difficult to classify with a single word. It was not exactly astonishment, although the situation he found was certainly not what he expected. It was something closer to serious curiosity, of the kind that does not need smiles to be gentle. "That is me," said Beatrice in a direct way, as was her manner. "Beatrice Sampson, are you Mr. Lucas Moretti?" The man nodded. He was indeed. He had come to see if she needed anything, that he did carpentry and minor repairs, that if she wanted he could take a look at the upstairs windows that had their planks nailed shut, that the estimate had no cost. Beatrice said that she did need it, and that she needed a lot of things, but that before any work she needed to know the price, because her budget was tight, and she preferred to know before committing. Lucas said he understood that he worked for a fair price, and that the estimate could be done without any obligation from either side. They walked through the house together, from room to room, and Beatrice noticed two things at the same time. The first was that he evaluated everything with genuine competence and without rushing. He would stop, touch the wood with his palm, test the stability of the boards with the weight of his body, look at the fitting of the roof shingles through the window, with an eye that clearly had seen a lot of good things and a lot of bad things, and knew how to distinguish the two. The second thing she noticed was that he made no comment about the 7 families. He did not speak of hauntings. He did not insinuate she was reckless for being there. He treated the house as if it were simply a house that needed care, which is what the house was. For Beatrice, in that moment, that was worth more than any praise could have been worth. In the upstairs bedroom, where she had opened the first window the day before, Lucas stood for a moment, looking through the open gap at the afternoon outside. The sun was going down, and the light that entered was of that deep, late-afternoon gold that the sycamore tree outside cut into moving shadows on the floor. He said, almost to himself, that the structure of the house was very good, that the foundations were solid, that they had built this house with quality materials and labor that knew what they were doing, and that with the right repairs it was going to last many years still. Beatrice stood looking at him while he said this, looking at his profile against the open window, and had a strange impression that he was not only talking about wood and stone, although it was impossible to say why. On the street, leaning against the iron gate while the late afternoon sun gilded the sycamore trees in a row, Lucas opened his little notebook and went through the estimated value for the windows, the floor, and the most urgent repairs, explaining each item with that clarity of someone who is not trying to confuse you. Beatrice did the math mentally with the speed of someone who has spent years counting pennies. It was possible, tight, but possible. "Can you start next week?" she asked. Lucas put the notebook in his pocket. "It can be on Thursday," he replied. "Early in the morning." They said goodbye with a simple nod. Beatrice stood at the gate for a moment after he turned the corner of Cedar Street and disappeared into the shade of the sycamores. Then she grabbed the bucket and the broom and went back inside for another hour of cleaning before the sun went away completely. But on the way back to the boarding house later, with her body tired in a way that was good because it was from honest work, Beatrice realized she was walking slower than necessary down Cedar Street, as if she were in no great hurry to arrive, and she also realized, with a kind of silent surprise that was almost amusing, that she was smiling without a specific reason. Thus went the first few days of Beatrice Sampson in Silent Valley. Days of broom and rag and bucket, of hands learning new skills in a rush because necessity is the best teacher, of nights at Mrs. Rose's boarding house, where the two drank chamomile tea on the front porch and talked about the town with that informality that grows naturally between women who respect each other from the beginning. Mrs. Rose was generous with information about the town. She told about the families who had passed through the Sycamore house with a tone that did not exaggerate but also did not minimize. The first family had left claiming noises at night they could not explain. The second spoke of a shadow in a window that appeared when no one was there. The third left after a week in such a hurry that they left a pot on the stove. The rest kept leaving with smaller stories that the imagination kept growing, adding a detail here, dramatizing there, until the house accumulated a fame that was a collective construction more than a verifiable fact. Beatrice listened to all this with the genuine attention that was her way of listening, took a sip of tea and said that old houses make noise because wood shifts with the cold and the heat, that a shadow in the window can be a sycamore branch in the wind, and that a rush to leave is sometimes more about the life of those who go than about the place that stays. Mrs. Rose sat for a moment with the glass of tea in her hand, looking at her with that narrowed eye of someone who is evaluating what they heard. Then she said it was a pity that Beatrice had not arrived sooner, because she would have spared the town a lot of unnecessary stories. They both laughed at the same time, and that was that. The resistance Beatrice encountered in Silent Valley came from other sides and in forms she already expected, because she knew how a small town works. Mrs. Clementine was the owner of the fabric store on the main street, a woman of 58 years with her hair tied back with the rigidity of someone who ties hair as if it were an act of discipline, an expression that rarely strayed from skepticism, and a voice slightly louder than necessary for ordinary conversations, as if she were always speaking to an audience larger than the one present. She had a habit of positioning herself at the entrance of her own store when there was movement on the street so as not to miss anything that passed by. She was not mean by definition nor by character. She was suspicious from a habit built over years, and she protected that suspicion with the dedication of someone who does not realize it is a prison. Beatrice met her on the third day when she stopped at the store to ask the price of a roll of plain cloth for temporary curtains. Mrs. Clementine assisted her with a surface-level politeness that anyone recognized as surface-level, gave her the price, but then, almost as if she could not contain the thing she wanted to say since the outsider walked in, said that she heard the young lady had bought the Sycamore house. Beatrice said she had. Mrs. Clementine shook her head from side to side, not exactly a denial, but something in that direction. She said that there were 7 families who had tried. That local people, people who knew the town, people who had history and roots, had not managed to stay, so an outsider. She stopped before finishing the sentence, as if politeness had shown up late, but had shown up. Beatrice calmly folded the roll of cloth, held it under her arm, and paid the exact amount to the penny without needing change, which made Mrs. Clementine frown slightly because it was a sign of a person who calculates well. She thanked her for the service with a naturalness that held no irony, and left. On the street, already on the cobblestone, she heard Mrs. Clementine comment to the neighbour at the store next door that the girl was going to last less than a month. "You can bet I am right." Beatrice heard it clearly. She did not stop. At the general store, Mr. Vernon, who was a man of 60 years with a thick moustache and the measured voice of someone who weighs every word like merchandise, posed the question differently, but with the same effect. When Beatrice went to buy cleaning supplies and asked to open a credit ledger, which was the informal credit that country general stores offered to established residents, Mr. Vernon looked her up and down and said, with his measured voice and neutral tone of someone who is being careful but not necessarily kind, that he had nothing against her personally, that he did not know her well enough to have anything against her, but that credit was for established residents, folks he knew, folks with history in the town. Beatrice explained that she was a homeowner, that she had the house deeds registered at the clerk's office. Mr. Vernon said that paperwork was one thing, and a guarantee was a different thing entirely, and that living in the Sycamore house was not exactly a guarantee of permanence, given the history that everyone in town knew. There was something unjust in that which Beatrice felt clearly, but arguing there was not her way, and it would not be efficient. She paid what she owed in cash, thanked him without irony, and left with a decision made silently. She was going to show Mr. Vernon and Mrs. Clementine and whoever else doubted her that the history of that house was being rewritten, and that the new history was going to be much better than the previous one. It was the kind of determination that makes no noise, but that does not waver a single inch. While she waited for Lucas's Thursday, Beatrice did what she knew how to do with what she had on hand. She cleaned, swept, removed accumulated rubble, fixed what she could with her hands and with her creativity. In a back room, she found an old wooden bench that with cleaning and wax looked good enough to use. In the backyard, she discovered there was a well with clean, cold water, which was better than she expected. And in the ruined vegetable garden, she found that dark, damp soil that is a sign of fertile earth, the kind that produces without much chatter when someone gives it attention. On Wednesday of the first week, while weeding the backyard with a hoe she had rented from Mr. Ernest, the neighbor who lived in the house next to the lane, a small thing happened that grew large in her memory. Mr. Ernest was a man of 67 years, thin with the thinness of someone who has always worked hard, white hair and a broad forehead that the years had made generous, and he had a habit of walking slowly with his hands crossed behind his back, standing still for long periods, looking at his own garden with an expression of quiet satisfaction. He was a man of very few words. Their first conversation lasted less than 2 minutes and involved renting the hoe and the price, which was so symbolic that Beatrice thought it best not to argue. That Wednesday, she was in the yard when she heard the squeak of the back gate and saw Mr. Ernest walk in, without being called, without warning, with a larger hoe than hers in his hand and an expression that did not invite conversation or explanation. He walked to the thickest corner of the weeds as if he knew exactly where he was going, planted the hoe in the ground with the precision of someone who has made that gesture thousands of times, and began to weed. Beatrice stood looking for a second. Then she went back to what she was doing. They worked side by side for almost 2 hours without exchanging a word. The only sound was the hose hitting the earth, the noise of cut weeds being tossed aside, the bird in the old apple tree that commented on something periodically. At the end, when most of the yard was weeded and the dark soil was exposed to the late afternoon sun, Mr. Ernest stuck the hoe in the ground, stood looking at the finished work with that expression of satisfaction that carried an extra degree in that moment, and simply said that the soil was good, that it produced well if you took care of it. Beatrice said thank you. She said she was going to plant some things as soon as she could. Mr. Ernest picked up the hoe, gave the nod that was a goodbye and an approval at the same time, and walked out the back gate the same way he had come in, without ceremony and without expecting thanks. Beatrice stood with her own hoe in hand, looking at the clean yard with the dark earth exposed, and felt that good tightness in her chest of someone who received kindness without asking, which is one of the purest feelings that exist. On Thursday early morning, when Beatrice was in the kitchen heating water for coffee on the stove that she had managed to clean with patience and that lit well when it caught with the right dry wood, she heard the knock on the main door. It was Lucas's knock, punctual as he had promised. He arrived with the wooden toolbox that looked to be the same age as him, and a competence in the way he entered and situated himself in the space that made the house less intimidating just by his presence, as if the space knew that someone who knows what they are doing had walked in. He brought a helper, a younger fellow named Tommy, who carried the larger box and who had a pleasant habit of whistling softly while he worked, not to draw attention but for himself, like someone who needs an internal soundtrack to concentrate. The two began with the upstairs windows, removing the nailed planks carefully so as not to damage the window frame, evaluating the hinges, checking the state of the wood, sanding where needed, and fitting where it had warped. Beatrice worked downstairs while they worked upstairs, and the sound of rhythmic hammering and the smell of freshly sanded wood drifting down the stairs filled the house in a way that felt like life, as if the house were waking up slowly, with that slowness of one who had been sleeping for a long time. At noon, while Beatrice was in the kitchen preparing her own hot plate she had brought from the boarding house, she heard footsteps in the entryway and found Mrs. Rose at the main door with an iron pot covered with a dish towel, saying she had made pinto beans and smoked sausage in excessive quantity and that she was not going to let it spoil. She also brought cornbread, wrapped in a cloth that was still warm and smelled of that specific scent of baked corn that has no substitute. The four of them ate sitting on the living room floor with their plates on their knees because there was no table yet. And there was something genuinely good about that improvised lunch on the wooden floor with the smell of sawdust in the air and the upstairs windows newly opened, casting a light that had not entered there in years. The beans were seasoned just right. The sausage had that smokiness that makes the mouth remember, and the cornbread had the sandy texture of something made with stone-ground cornmeal. Lucas ate without talking much, as was his way that Beatrice was learning to recognize, but she noticed he looked around the room sometimes with that attention that was not just a professional evaluating the state of the work. It was the look of someone who was imagining how the place was going to look when it was finished. At some point, Tommy made a joke about the beans definitely being the best he had eaten in his entire life, which made Mrs. Rose threaten with a serious face never to bring them again, which made Tommy add that then he had been gravely misled about the quality of the beans, which made everyone laugh. And in the middle of that laughter, Beatrice looked at Lucas, and Lucas was looking at her, and the two were smiling at the same time. It was a quick moment, of a few seconds, those that pass before you decide whether you are going to notice them. But it lingered. At the end of the day, with the sun already low and orange, and the upstairs windows open expelling the air that had stood stagnant there for years, Lucas walked down the stairs with his toolbox and went to the door where Beatrice was. He said he would return the following week for the floor, which was the next task on the list. That the roof was going to need extra help from a mason, that he would speak to an acquaintance to evaluate it. Beatrice said thank you, and that she would have the agreed amount set aside for when he returned. Lucas nodded, picked up the box, and walked toward the gate. At the threshold of the yard he stopped, which she did not expect, and turned around. He said the house was looking good, that it was starting to look like a home. Beatrice stood at the doorframe with her hand on the wood, and said that was exactly what she wanted. He looked at her for a second with those dark eyes that, when they looked at something, looked inward, nodded slowly, and walked away down Cedar Street with his toolbox swaying slightly beside his body. Beatrice remained at the threshold after he disappeared around the curve of the street. The afternoon was golden, and the air held that scent of worked wood that had stayed in the house and was drifting out the open door. Then she went inside, closed the door with the heavy iron key, and walked up the stairs, running her fingers over the carved banister as she had done since the first day. The bedroom that would be hers had the window open. There was little in it still, just the mattress she had brought from the boarding house, rolled up and tied with twine in the corner, her leather suitcase under the window, her father's portrait on the narrow shelf she had improvised with a board and 2 nails. But the window was open, and the light was coming in, and outside the sycamores made that rustle of leaves in the wind that she was already learning to recognize as the sound of her own house. Beatrice sat on the mattress, took off her shoes one by one, and stayed like that for a good while, just listening. She was home. It still needed a lot of work. There was still a long road to travel, but it was hers, and she was staying, and that was enough for her heart to be quiet in a way it had not been for a long time. That night was the first one she slept in, the Sycamore house. She slept very well. The following week, Lucas returned for the floor work. He arrived at the same time, with the same punctuality that Beatrice had learned to recognize as a fundamental characteristic of his way of being, with Tommy behind him and an additional box with specific tools for that job. Working with the floor was a slower and more meticulous job than the windows, lifting the loose boards without damaging the firm ones, checking the structural joists underneath, reattaching them with new nails in the right joint, and leveling with a plane where they had warped slightly over the years. The sound of that day was different from the previous week, deeper, more rhythmic, with the measured strokes of the plane interspersed with the rasping of sandpaper and the pop of a board snapping back into place. Beatrice learned to recognize each tool by the specific sound it made, and there was something good in this new familiarity that grew without her planning it. During the mid-morning break, while Tommy went down to fetch water from the well in the yard, Lucas sat on the top step of the stairs with a cup of coffee Beatrice had made on the stove. It was simple coffee, with molasses, strong the way the countryside makes it, the kind that warms you inside in a specific way. Lucas took a sip, sat in silence for a moment looking at the living room below, which already looked different, with part of the floor redone, and the windows open letting the light in. Then he said, almost thinking out loud, that he had passed in front of this house some 3 or 4 times in the previous years when walking down Cedar Street, and that he had never been able to help noticing how it was being wasted. That it was a quality build, one of the best on the street, and that it stuck in his mind seeing those boarded-up windows. Beatrice was leaning against the kitchen door frame with her own cup of coffee in her hands and listened to that with real attention. She asked if he knew the story of who had built the house. Lucas thought for a moment. He said his parents had told him something, that the house had been raised by a wealthy farmer some 40 years ago, for his wife who was coming from another town, that the wife had lived there for a few years, and then the family had moved to Louisville because of the husband's business, and that the property had passed from hand to hand since then, being rented out, being sold, being abandoned between each of those changes. Beatrice thought about this after Lucas went back to work. 40 years of history inside those walls. A family that had built it, wanting it to be beautiful, as the carved banister and the worked ceiling friezes showed. People who had lived there, who had lit that fireplace, who had opened those windows in the morning. And then years of departures, of abandonment, of air that stood stagnant. Somehow this made her feel the house less as a problem she had bought and more as a responsibility she had taken on. Like someone who takes on the care of something that was neglected and that now needs attention. By the end of Lucas's second week of work, the floor was complete. The board settled, leveled, with the varnish he had applied late last Friday afternoon still smelling faintly of that resin that is simultaneously mechanical and alive. When the Monday morning sun fell on the floor, Beatrice stood at the living room entrance with her bare feet on the warm wood and felt a physical and simple pleasure, the kind that needs no words at all to be complete. It was hers, it was becoming beautiful, and it had been done with honest work. In those early days of establishing herself in the house, Beatrice created a routine that quickly began to feel natural, in a way the boarding house room in Louisville had never felt, even after years. She woke up early when the little church bell rang at 6. She drank her coffee in the kitchen, which was becoming more functional every day and smelling more and more like good, well-used things. She worked in the yard in the mornings when the sun was not yet heavy, then moved on to the indoor chores in the afternoon. At night she sewed by the light of the kerosene lamp. The temporary curtains of plain cloth she had sewn were in the living room windows. The kitchen held the basic utensils bought little by little with cash at the general store. In the backyard, in the dirt that Mr. Ernest had helped to weed, Beatrice planted tomatoes, kale, parsley, and a row of sunflowers from seeds she had bought at a Saturday market, not because sunflowers were edible, but because she wanted color in the yard. She wanted something that looked toward the sun every day. Mr. Ernest showed up in the third week with lettuce and parsley seedlings without saying a word beyond a nod of the head, placed them at the edge of the garden bed, and left. Beatrice planted those seedlings with the same care she used for sowing, paying attention to spacing and depth, and when they began to sprout a few days later, she stood looking at them for a time that was certainly more than necessary. There was a specific satisfaction in seeing what you planted grow, different from any other satisfaction. It was the satisfaction of someone who participated in something that went beyond their own capacity for control, because you plant, but the plant is the one that grows, and that is a lesson that does not come from a book. The town kept looking with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Mrs. Clementine had turned the issue into a kind of permanent topic of conversation. Every time someone walked past the front of the store, she found a way to include the subject, so that the skepticism regarding Beatrice spread through the town like smoke, discreetly but in every direction, that the girl was an outsider, that she was alone, that she would not last, that the house had expelled 7 families. Beatrice found out about this because Silent Valley was a small town, and a small town has no secrets, it only has history that arrives through the wrong door. She learned of it from Mrs. Rose, who told her with the expression of someone who does not like to bear bad news, but who thinks the other person has the right to know what is being said. Beatrice listened, thanked her, and replied that she understood Mrs. Clementine, that she was not being cruel, she was being human in the most predictable way, because it is safer to bet against what you do not understand than to get involved and be surprised. And that the best answer to skepticism was never an argument, but a result. Mrs. Rose looked at her for a moment with an expression of renewed respect and said that Beatrice was a woman of great sense. Beatrice smiled and said she was a woman of little patience for unnecessary fights, which led to more or less the same result, but by a different path. They both laughed in the same second, which was something that happened frequently between them. It was on a Friday in the third week that Lucas returned alone, without Tommy, to check some hinges on the large kitchen window that was still catching slightly in a specific movement. It was a small fix, less than an hour's work. Beatrice was making bread. It was a skill she had learned from her mother and practiced little in Louisville due to the lack of a proper oven, but which the kitchen of the Sycamore house with its wood stove fully permitted. The dough was rising in a bowl covered with a clean dish towel, with that light, yeasty smell of fermentation that is one of the most honest smells that exist, and there was flour on the stone counter and on the thick cloth apron Beatrice had sewn for herself from scraps left over from the curtains. Lucas walked in through the kitchen door that was open to the yard, as was the custom now, saw the state of everything, and for a brief moment that Beatrice did not miss his expression, held that specific quality of someone who is seeing something they did not expect to see, and which somehow pleases them more than they expected to be pleased. He said he would come back later if she was in the middle of something important. Beatrice said there was no need, that the bread was waiting for the oven, that he could come in and do what he had come to do. He worked on the window hinge while she prepared the tray to take to the oven, and for a good while the two stayed in the same kitchen with the afternoon sun falling through the window that now worked well, each doing their own thing in a silence that was the comfortable kind. Not the silence of two people who have nothing to say and are silent from lack. The other kind. The silence of two people who do not need to fill the air with words to feel good in each other's company. When Lucas finished with the hinge and the bread was already in the oven, the smell that began to spread through the kitchen was one of the best smells in the world. Baking dough, flour and heat and yeast together, the specific smell of a house that has people inside. Lucas started putting his tools away in the small box he had brought, with that organized care that was his way, and then he stood still for a second, like someone calculating whether to say something or not. He said the house was looking very good, that in many years doing work in the town he had seen many houses get remodeled, but that he did not recall seeing a house change so fast. That it was the kind of thing that happened when the person taking care of it truly wanted it to be good. Beatrice stood still with the dish towel in her hand and looked at him. There was something in his tone that was more than a professional comment, and they both knew it, although neither would name it just yet. She said thank you. She said the house was helping too. Lucas raised his eyes from what he was doing and looked at her. He asked what she meant by that. Beatrice spent a moment organizing how to explain that properly, which was something she had felt but had not yet put into words. She said that when you take care of something that was abandoned, you discover that the process of taking care also takes care of you, that she had arrived in that town emptier than the house itself, and that now, weeks later, she was fuller, not with things, with purpose, with direction, with something she could not fully name but felt clearly. Lucas remained silent for a second that was meant for absorbing what he had heard. Then he said, with that quiet and direct voice that was his voice when he was saying something that truly mattered, that he understood that there were moments in carpentry work that were like that a piece of wood spoiled, got crooked, lost its varnish, began to seem useless, and it felt like the sensible way was to discard it. But that when you took that in your hands with the right tool and started to work with patience, sometimes you discovered that the wood beneath the damage was the best you had ever touched, that the damage was on the surface, and that what was essential was intact. They stood looking at each other for a second longer than the subject required. Then the kitchen timer rang, which was a little metal bell she had bought at the general store, because she discovered she lost track of time when working, and Beatrice turned to the oven with the dish towel, and Lucas picked up the toolbox, and the moment closed in the natural way that moments do when it is not yet time, but when the time is approaching. They both left the kitchen, carrying something that was not there when they walked in. Here, the subscriber who has not left a thumbs up yet can leave it now, because this story is just beginning, and what comes next will squeeze your heart even more. In the days that followed, Beatrice's routine gained the more established rhythm of someone who has found their own beat. The morning began with the yard, which was producing more and more as the vegetable garden grew. The tomato plants had climbed up the trellis she had improvised with sticks and twine. The kale was broad and dark. The parsley and chives were more than one person could use, and she started leaving them in a little box at the gate with a simple written note saying that anyone who wanted could take some, that there was extra. The little box was always empty before noon. There was something in that gesture of leaving food at the gate that changed something in the town's perception of her. It was not a strategy, it was simply what made sense to do when you have more than you need. But the people who walked down Cedar Street and took the greens or the lettuce began to see the Sycamore house with different eyes, to see the person who lived there as a concrete person, not as a phenomenon or curiosity. Mr. Ernest took from the little box every morning with the same gesture of someone taking what is theirs by right, without formality, which was the greatest form of acceptance he had to offer. Mrs. Rose appeared sometimes in the late afternoon with some bread or a sweet she had made in excessive quantity, which was the recurring gentle lie, and she would stay on the front porch for an hour or more drinking tea with Beatrice and telling stories of the town with that mixture of affection and shrewdness that was her way of narrating, and the town watched slowly as the house changed. The open windows were the most visible sign. Those windows that had been nailed planks for years were now open on sunny mornings and breezy afternoons, with the simple cotton curtains swaying, and whoever passed by Cedar Street saw the light entering and leaving that place that had been dark for so long. Saw smoke rising from the chimney in the morning, a sign of a lit stove and brewing coffee. Saw the light of a kerosene lamp at night, a sign of life that was staying. Inside the house, every week had its own victory. In the fourth week, it was the fireplace, which Mr. Foster, the town mason, cleaned on a Saturday morning with that specific skill of someone who knows what is inside a chimney after years. On the afternoon of that same day, Beatrice lit it for the first time and sat in front of the fire on the wooden bench she had recovered, with the smell of eucalyptus firewood, which is the specific smell of country fireplace heat, and sat there for a whole hour, doing nothing but listening to the crackle and watching the flame. In the fifth week, it was the table. Lucas had brought a leftover from a job, a round hardwood table that was a remnant of a larger set, and had presented it as the remainder of a service that was going to take up space in the shop. Beatrice accepted without questioning, because questioning would only make the thing more complicated than it needed to be. The table sat in the center of the living room with 4 chairs around it, and the first time Beatrice ate lunch sitting at that table with her plate in front of her and the window open beside her, she had the physical sensation of having arrived at a place she had been trying to reach for a long time. There was also the shelf beside the fireplace that Lucas had made in a quick afternoon with scrap wood, a shelf that gradually became occupied by second-hand books bought at the Saturday market, a clay pitcher she had found in a store that sold antique things, a jar of dried lavender that Mrs. Rose had given, saying it chased away termites, which was partially true and partially an excuse to give a gift. And the sunflowers in the backyard bloomed on a June morning that was cold and clear, and with the sun of that pure winter white that does not heat much, but illuminates greatly. and Beatrice walked out the back door early in the morning with her coffee in hand and stood looking at those yellow flowers that had their necks turned in the exact direction of the light. And she cried a little, not out of sadness. Out of something else, the kind of thing that language has a name for, but that when you feel it seems to go beyond the name. The house was becoming a home. Slowly but surely, day by day and brick by brick and board by board, it was becoming a home. And Lucas kept showing up. There was always some new job, it is true, because a house that spent years abandoned does not finish needing attention overnight. There was always something to evaluate, to fix, to adjust. But Beatrice began to notice, with that perception you have of things that are not said, that the visits sometimes lasted longer than the job required, that he stayed drinking coffee after the tool was already in the box, that he found things to comment on when the tool was already put away and the work was done. There was an afternoon in June when the two were on the front porch, after a job on the floorboards of the hallway, drinking the coffee Beatrice had made with the shortbread cookies she had learned from Mrs. Rose on a Saturday morning in the boarding house kitchen. The sun was low and golden as it got in that month, the sycamore trees on the street casting long shadows on the dirt ground, and the air had that dry chill of a late winter afternoon that asks for a coat, but is good. Lucas said the porch turned out well after he had adjusted the railing the previous week, that he had been worried about the lean he had noticed the last time. Beatrice said it turned out very well indeed, and that the porch was the place she liked most in the house, because she could see the street and the large sycamore tree at the same time, and that there was something about being able to see the world from a safe place that was different from anything else. Lucas was silent for a moment, that silence of someone who is hearing more than the words, and then he said he understood exactly what she meant. That carpentry was like that for him sometimes, that he was inside a job, with the wood and the tools and the smell of sawdust, and that the world outside existed, but was at a manageable distance. Beatrice looked at him sideways, in that way of someone who is seeing a person in a slightly more complete way than they had seen before, and asked if he had always liked carpentry or if he had chosen the trade for another reason. The question was more personal than anything they had exchanged so far, and they both knew it. Lucas sat with the cup of coffee in his hands and answered after a moment that it was both. That his father had taught him the trade when he was still young, that Joseph Moretti had the hands of someone who worked wood since he arrived in America without knowing how to speak a word of English, but with the entire trade in the memory of his body, that he had learned by watching his father work before learning by his father's hand, and that when he learned by hand, it was like recognizing something he already knew in another way. He said his father had passed away 5 years ago, and that the carpentry shop was the closest thing to having him near that he knew. That when he was with the wood, he was somehow with his father, and that this was enough for the work to be more than work. There was something of trust in that, of a thing not said before that was being said, and Beatrice received it with the care it deserved. She stayed quiet for a moment and then said she understood. That her father's cardigan was like that for her, that sometimes she could not explain why she wore it on difficult days, but that on those days she put it on the same way someone else seeks company. The two remained silent for a while. That was good in a way that neither of them needed to name. The shadow of the sycamore trees grew on Cedar Street. The sun descended behind the roofs, and the two stayed on the porch until the coffee went cold, which neither of them noticed in time. The roof was the biggest challenge of the first month and a half. Mr. Foster, who besides cleaning chimneys understood roofing, had given the diagnosis without going around the bushes on a morning inspection visit. It was not just the broken slate shingles on the left side. There was a section of woodwork that had rotted from years of infiltration and needed to be replaced before the September rains. Without that, the first heavy rain was going to cause damage that would cost double the current repair. It was a mason's and carpenter's job together, and it was expensive. Not absurdly, but it was the kind of amount that made Beatrice sit down with the paper of expenses and reorganize everything with that precision of someone who has lived counting pennies and who never lost that skill even when things improved a little. She did the math. It was possible, but it was going to be very tight. It was going to leave almost nothing in reserve for the following month. And September was the month she had planned to start taking sewing clients at home, which was the income plan she had drawn up during her nights at the boarding house, to set up a small studio in the smaller upstairs bedroom, start serving the women of the town who needed sewing, and build a clientele gradually the same way she had built everything else, with consistent work and honest quality. But September without a fixed roof meant September with a basin in the bedroom to catch leaks, and a basin in the bedroom to catch leaks was not the impression she wanted to give a new client. So she did what was necessary. She decided on the roof and reorganized the rest. Lucas was there when she made this decision, not because she had asked for advice, but because he had arrived to evaluate the woodwork and ended up staying while she did the math at the kitchen table with that concentration of someone who no longer hears what is around them. When she lifted her head from the papers and said to go ahead with the roof repair to whatever extent it needed, he looked at her for a second with that expression she had learned to recognize as a genuine evaluation, and it had no judgment inside. Then he said he was only going to charge for the materials and the essential labor, that the rest could wait. Beatrice said it was not necessary. Lucas said he knew it was not necessary, but that he was going to charge it that way anyway. She stood looking at him for a second, feeling that specific mix of gratitude and something else that had no name yet but had physical weight in her chest, and said thank you with that direct tone that belongs to a person who makes no fuss, but who truly feels it. He nodded his head and said he would start on Monday. The roof repair took 5 days. Mr. Foster with 2 helpers on the shingles, Lucas with Tommy on the woodwork, and Beatrice in the yard below, sometimes watching and sometimes simply continuing the yard work, hearing the noise above which was of a thing being done right. There was something of physical satisfaction in seeing that work happen, in knowing that when September arrived with the rains, the house was going to be ready to receive them. On the last day, when the final touches were made, and Mr. Foster climbed down from the roof with that air of someone who has finished a job well done and is ready for the next one, Lucas stood in the yard looking up with his hand shielding his eyes from the sun. Then he looked at Beatrice, who was next to him with her hand in the same position, looking at the same point, the two of them looking at the roof that had been fixed. He said it was good, that it was going to withstand whatever rain September wanted to send. Beatrice said it was good to hear that, and then she added, almost by accident, that the house was becoming the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and that she saw this in a way different from facade beauty. It was the beauty of a thing that has been cared for. Lucas did not answer immediately. He kept looking at the roof for a moment still, and then shifted his eyes to her in a way that was brief, but that was not casual at all. He said, with that low voice that was the voice of when he said something real, that there were many things in this town that had gotten more beautiful since May. Beatrice went quiet for a second. Then she adjusted the hair that had escaped her bun from the day's work, the simple movement of bringing a hand to the hair that is always involuntary, and said she was going to make coffee for everyone. She went inside with a step slightly more hurried than necessary, and in the kitchen she stood still for a moment with her hands resting on the edge of the stone sink, looking out the window at the yard where she could still hear the voices outside, and felt her heart beating in a way that had nothing to do with the fatigue of the day. She smiled at the window before starting to make the coffee. August arrived with the sky higher and the sun whiter, and the sycamore house was different from everything it had been when Beatrice walked in for the first time in May. The windows were open whenever the weather permitted. The front garden had been weeded and replanted with red geraniums and pink impatiens that Mrs. Rose had given as cuttings, and which now grew along the stone path to the door with that disorganized and beautiful abundance of plants that are happy where they are. The iron gate had been oiled and squeaked no more, although Beatrice sometimes felt that the early squeak had its own nostalgia. The front porch now had 2 wicker chairs that Mr. Ernest had shown up with one morning without warning, as was his way, saying they were sitting unused in a corner of his house and were going to ruin if they stayed idle. Beatrice placed them on the porch and began sitting there in the afternoons after the day's work, with her tea or coffee, watching the peaceful movement of Cedar Street, the sycamore trees casting the shadow they always cast. It was in that August that the studio began to take shape. The smaller upstairs bedroom was prepared over the course of several afternoons. The window Lucas had fixed was letting in an afternoon light that was perfect for sewing work, the kind of light that reveals the detail of the stitch without tiring the eyes. Beatrice set up the sewing machine she had brought from Louisville, a sturdy piece of iron and wood that had crossed the entire state in the luggage hold of the bus, wrapped in a blanket, in the position that allowed her to look out the window while she worked, which was a luxury she had never had in Louisville. On the studio shelf rested the fabric she had purchased carefully in the previous weeks, colors and textures organized with that methodicalness that was her way for everything. Floral cotton for everyday pieces, neutral-colored muslin for lining, dark velvet from a roll she had found for a special price in a fabric shop in a neighboring town, the kind of fabric that asks for quality work so as not to waste the material. When the studio was ready, Beatrice stood in the doorway looking inside for a long time. It was a small room, but it was completely hers, completely organized by her hand, completely dedicated to the work she knew how to do better than anything else. The sewing machine shining in the afternoon with that shine of well-cared-for iron, the sewing kit on the shelf with the threads arranged by color, the ruler and the scissors in the exact position where they would always be. She walked down the stairs and went to the front gate, where she had hung a small wooden sign with letters she herself had painted in black ink, with that firm and legible handwriting developed by those who spend years writing on tags and receipts. The sign read, Beatrice Sampson, Sewing and Alterations, and below that, the business hours. She stood on the sidewalk looking at the sign for a moment, with her hands crossed in front of her, feeling the August sun on her back. The first client appeared on Wednesday of the same week. It was a young woman named Florence, married to the town pharmacist, who had seen the sign on the gate and mentioned it to a neighbor who mentioned it to another, and who appeared one morning at the door with a party dress she had bought at a dry goods store in a larger city, and which was loose in the shoulders and long in the hem, in a way that completely depersonalized what should be beautiful. Beatrice received Florence in the living room, examined the dress with that technical attention that is the specific attention of the trade, made the markings with pins with the speed of someone who knows what they are doing, and stated the price and the deadline. Florence looked at her with an expression of genuine relief and said she had tried to alter it herself, and it had been disastrous, and that she was worried the dress was going to be ruined. Beatrice said it was going to be great, and it was. When Florence returned to pick up the dress 3 days later and tried it on in the room Beatrice had improvised as a fitting room with a long mirror she had found on the second floor, the expression on her face was the kind of expression a tailor or seamstress takes years to learn how to produce, and which Beatrice had learned at her first job with Mrs. Eunice, the expression of someone seeing themselves the way they wanted to be seen. Florence told all her friends. In September, the studio was booked for 2 weeks ahead. In October, it was booked for a month. It was in October that the matter with Mrs. Clementine changed. Not in a dramatic way, not with a speech or an apology formulated and delivered like a letter. It changed the way things change in a small town between people who are proud, but who deep down have a sense of justice. slowly, without anyone needing to admit anything out loud. It began when Mrs. Clementine's niece needed an urgent alteration on a dress for a wedding, and all the dressmakers in town were busy or did not do the kind of work the dress required, and someone suggested Beatrice, and Mrs. Clementine said she would take it herself because the sewing lady was over at the Sycamore house. She said this still with the tone of someone who is being reluctant, but rational. Beatrice received the niece with the same naturalness she received any client, did the work that was meant to be done with the same quality as always, and when Mrs. Clementine went to pick up her niece and saw the altered dress, she went silent for a moment that was longer than neutral silence. Then she said, with the tone of someone yielding more than they usually do but who has decided they are going to yield, that the work was very well done, that there was care in it. Beatrice said, "Thank you," and Mrs. Clementine stood there another moment like someone who still has something to say and is deciding whether to go ahead. And then she said that perhaps it had taken her a while to understand what the young lady was doing there. That it was not exactly a criticism. It was that she herself had seen many people arrive in that town with a plan that did not last, and that she had become suspicious out of habit. Beatrice said she understood that perfectly. Mrs. Clementine nodded with that specific solemnity of a person who does not apologize with those words, but who delivers the substance of it in another format, and left with the niece and the dress. The sign on the gate of the studio remained hung, and Beatrice Sampson gained one more regular client on Cedar Street. Mr. Vernon opened the credit ledger without her asking again, on an October afternoon when she went to the general store to buy wheat flour, and he simply picked up the notebook and said it was ready for when she wanted to use it. No further explanation, no formal acknowledgement that he had been unfair before. Just the ledger open on the counter with her name written on the cover in that calligraphic handwriting of someone who learned to write with care. Beatrice said thank you and bought the flour with cash the same way as always, because she preferred it that way when possible. But the ledger was a sign of something she understood without anyone needing to translate. The town had decided she was staying. And Beatrice, who had decided that the day she first walked into that house and opened the first window, felt that the two decisions, hers and the town's, had finally arrived at the same place. And Lucas kept showing up. Sometimes with a job, sometimes without a job, but with some pretext that they both pretended to take seriously, because it was easier that way, while there was something between them that was still taking shape. Something that was too real to be rushed, and that both of them, in different ways and for different reasons, knew needed to arrive at the right time. There was the afternoon he had brought oak boards from a tree that had fallen on a property outside of town. Good wood. He had kept thinking of making shelves for a client who would appreciate it. And he had shown up at the Sycamore house on a Friday afternoon with the wood in his cart and told Beatrice he thought it could be for the studio, for the shelves where she kept the fabrics, because oak wood was good for that, as it did not warp over time. Beatrice stood looking at the boards and then at him and said they were beautiful, that such wood was rare, that she was going to think about it all week long. Lucas said he would make them whenever she wanted, that he would keep the boards at the shop while they were not needed. She said it would be next week then, if he could. And he said he could, and there was in the way he said it something that was not just about carpentry, that they both knew it, and that neither said anything about it, because the moment was not yet the moment, but it was approaching. There was the morning when Beatrice was in the yard picking tomatoes and lifted her head, and Lucas was standing at the back gate with the toolbox he had forgotten the previous afternoon, and for a second the two stood looking at each other in that October morning light that was clear and clean and had that specific quality of approaching spring. And Beatrice said good morning, and Lucas said good morning, and neither of them moved for a second that lasted longer than the good mornings required. And there was the night of the town's autumn harvest festival, on a Saturday in mid-October, when all of Silent Valley went to the square with the bandstand decorated with colored paper and the smell of roasted corn and roasted peanuts and the gunpowder from firecrackers. The boys set off at the edge of the square. And the band from a neighboring town playing those country waltzes that were old and that everyone knew. And Beatrice was with Mrs. Rose when Lucas appeared with a neighbor, and the neighbor went another way, and suddenly it was just the two of them standing near the bandstand with the noise of the festival around them and the light of the paper lanterns swaying in the wind. Lucas asked if she liked to dance. Beatrice said she had liked it a lot in another time, that she had not danced in years. Lucas went quiet for a second, with that hesitation of someone calculating, and then said there was a waltz playing right now, if she wanted. She stood still for a moment, that was for truly deciding, not performatively, but internally, that decision that seems small on the outside, but that you know is not. And she said yes. They danced a waltz, and then another, with that polite formality of people dancing together for the first time, who feel at once the formality and something else that the formality contains but does not exhaust. His hand on her waist with that firmness that was the way he did everything, firm but without squeezing. Her hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth through the linen shirt he had worn for the festival. His face close enough for her to hear when he said, without looking at her directly, but without letting the words go to the wind, that it was good to dance with someone who was not afraid to keep the step. Beatrice lifted her eyes to him. She said, with that direct voice that was her way for everything, that she had learned early on, that being afraid of the step is more work than just walking. Lucas looked at her in that moment, with those eyes that when they looked inward, and there was a smile at the corner of his mouth that was rare to see, and which therefore held a specific value. The waltz ended. The two stood still for an extra moment before letting go, that moment that exists between two people when the music stops, but the rhythm does not. Then they went to get roasted corn at Mr. Ernest's stall, who was selling at the festival with the same silence as always, but who, upon seeing them together, gave a nod that meant he had noticed but was not going to say anything, because it was not his way to say anything, which is the most honest form of discretion that exists. That night, when Beatrice returned to the Sycamore house and climbed the stairs in the dark with the kerosene lamp in her hand, she ran her fingers over the carved banister as she always did, and felt a lightness in her chest that was not of something new, but was of something that was finally beginning to become what it was. November began with the first summer rains that arrived as they always arrive in the country. In the afternoon, suddenly, with that smell of earth-receiving rain that has no equal anywhere in the world, Beatrice was in the studio when the first heavy rain arrived, and she listened to the sound of it on the roof with that specific attention of someone who had spent weeks worrying about the roof. It was a good sound, rain beating against solid slate, against woodwork that had been repaired with no leaks, no seepage, no damp smell that is a sign of water entering where it should not. The house was ready. It had received the rain. Beatrice stopped the sewing machine for a moment, just to hear that sound, with her hands resting on the wooden counter and her face turned toward the window where the rain ran in threads down the glass. Then she returned to the sewing with a smile that had nothing to do with the dress being made. It was in that November that Lucas appeared on a Saturday afternoon, not with a toolbox, not with wood, not with any pretext of work. He came with 2 rose bushes he had bought at the little market, wrapped in damp newspaper to maintain the root, one red and one yellow, and said, with that directness that was more hers than his, but which he had learned from her, that he had thought the rose bushes would look good in the front bed, next to the geraniums. Beatrice stood in the doorway looking at the rose bushes and then at him, and felt that thing in her chest that was no longer surprise but was never going to stop squeezing. She said they were going to look great indeed. He asked if he could help plant them. She said he could. They planted the 2 rose bushes in the front bed that November afternoon, on their knees in the bed with their hands in the dirt. And there was something completely simple and completely right about it. On this afternoon, where the rain had passed early and left the smell of wet earth and a deep blue clean sky, and the golden late afternoon light that is the specific light after a summer rain. When they finished, Lucas stood looking at the rose bushes planted in the bed, brushed the dirt off his hands against each other, and then looked at Beatrice, who was making the same movement beside him. He said, without beating around the bush, but with that low voice that was the voice of important things, that he did not know if it was the right time to say something, but that there was a thing he wanted to say, and that it had been with him since before October. Beatrice looked at him without saying anything, which was also a way of saying he could speak. Lucas said that since May, since the first time he had come to see that house, there was something he could not fully explain. That he had come back week after week, and that it had been work in the beginning, that was true, but that it had stopped being just work at a point he could not exactly pinpoint when it was. That in that town where he had lived his whole life, he had learned the difference between just being and truly staying, and that with her, here in this house, there was something different from anything else he knew. He paused for a moment, that kind of pause of someone who has finished saying what they came to say and is now truly waiting. Beatrice stood looking at him for a second that was about feeling the entire thing, not just the words, but everything underneath the words. And then she said that she had arrived in that town in May with a small suitcase and a list of things that needed to be done, and that she had taken on the hardest thing first, which was the house, and that she had been honest about the rest, which was that she did not know what else could come, that she had let things arrive in their own time, that there was something in that way of arriving, patient and consistent, week after week. That was the way she respected most, for someone to make themselves present. Lucas remained silent, listening to every word, with that total attention that was his way of listening. Beatrice said she would like to know more about him. That there were pieces she did not know yet, his life before, what he dreamed for his own life, what kept him awake at dawn when that happened. She said she wanted to learn those things over time, not all at once, the way good things are known, with time and with presence. Lucas was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said that was what he wanted too, exactly that. The 2 of them stood in the front garden bed, with the newly planted rose bushes, the earth still dark with moisture around the seedlings, the sun descending behind the sycamores of Cedar Street. And there was a quietness around them that was the kind that happens when something that was coming has finally arrived. Lucas asked if she wanted to have dinner with him that night, that he had an idea for a place. Beatrice said yes, that she was just going to change her apron for a less dusty dress. He smiled truly, with his whole face participating, which was the smile she had seen few times and therefore knew the value of. She went inside to change her clothes, walked up the stairs running her fingers over the carved banister as always, and when she reached the upstairs hallway, she stopped for a second, just listening. The house was quiet around her. The rain had passed. The sun was going down, and the light coming through the open windows was of that deep gold that was the specific light of that house at that hour, which Beatrice had already learned to recognize as her light, the light that belonged to those walls and those windows, and that did not exist anywhere else in the world in the same way. She thought of the day she had arrived in this town with her leather suitcase and her list of things to do, and the quiet determination of someone who has nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. She thought of the first window she had opened, of the golden dust that had flown in the May afternoon, of the bird that had not been scared. She thought of Mr. Ernest with his hoe uncalled, of Mrs. Rose with the warm beans, of the simple cloth curtains swaying in the downstairs windows, of the sunflowers that had bloomed that June morning, of the roof that had withstood the first November rain without a single leak. She thought of Lucas standing at the back gate that October morning with the forgotten toolbox, and of the waltz at the town festival, and of the rose bushes that were now in the front bed waiting to grow. She traded her apron for the dark cotton dress that was the prettiest she had, the one she saved for days, that required clothes that matched the importance of the day. She arranged her hair in the bedroom mirror with attention, but without exaggeration. She put her father's cardigan over her shoulders because the November night still held that chill that winter leaves in the air even after it is gone. She went down the stairs. Lucas was waiting on the front porch, sitting in one of Mr. Ernest's wicker chairs, with his hat in his hand, and the calm expression that was his expression when he was where he wanted to be. He stood up when he heard her arrive. He looked at her with that look that looked inward. Beatrice closed the door with the heavy iron key that was hers and no one else's, put the key in her pocket, and walked down the porch steps. The two walked down Cedar Street, under the sycamores that already had fewer leaves because November had begun its work, and there was something completely natural in that movement of walking beside someone as if it were a thing that already existed before it began. One cannot tell what happened in the following months without mentioning what that winter had left permanent. The town of Silent Valley began to understand, little by little, and with that specific wisdom of a small place that observes more than it speaks, that Beatrice Sampson had arrived to stay. It was no longer curiosity or skepticism. It was recognition, the kind that only comes when time has passed and evidence has accumulated. The sycamore house was visible, daily proof of this. It was proof in the windows open every morning, in the garden with geraniums and impatiens, and the rose bushes that grew over the months and bloomed for the first time on a following September morning, with that colourful persistence of a plant that felt at home. It was proof in the studio sign on the gate, which began to have a waiting list. It was proof in the smell of bread that drifted out the kitchen window on Thursdays, the day Beatrice had established as Bread Day, which was a tradition she had created alone, but that the neighbourhood had adopted uninvited, in the sense that there was always someone walking down Cedar Street at that hour with a slightly slower pace, like someone who does not want to miss the scent. And the story between Beatrice and Lucas grew in the same way as everything that grew well in that place, dispatched in roots before being showy in appearance, deep before being exhibited, real before being declared. The two went along through that summer and after the summer, and it became more natural every week, as things that belong together do. The conversations on the porch that lasted until the afternoon turned to night. The Saturdays when he helped in the yard, not because there was a job, but because he was there and the yard needed something and it was natural that he helped. The afternoons when she took lunch to the carpentry shop when she knew he was tied up in a big job, which was something that started because one day she made more than she was going to eat, and because the shop was on the way, and which became a habit without anyone explicitly deciding it. There was the afternoon when Beatrice had found a poetry book at the Saturday market, an old book with a worn leather cover and pages that smelled like the specific paper of a book that was read a lot, and she had taken it home and read it out loud to herself on the porch, as was her habit with poetry. And Lucas had arrived in the middle and stood at the gate, listening without announcing his presence. And she had noticed, but kept reading for a moment before stopping. And the two had looked at each other with that understanding that the moment was too good to be named. There was the July morning when there was a light frost, the rare frost of that winter that covered the yard in crystalline white, that the morning pierced with that winter light that is bluish before the sun truly arrives. And Beatrice had gone out to see the sunflowers, which were resilient, but which the frost had left drooping. And Lucas had arrived at the same time to check a porch beam he had mentioned the week before, and the two had stood side by side in the freezing yard, looking at the sunflowers covered in ice crystals that the morning light crossed in tiny rainbows. And there was something in that image that was of a specific beauty that only exists when the thing is real and you are right there next to another person who is also seeing it. Lucas had said the sunflowers were going to be fine when the sun arrived, that they were plants of much more endurance than they appeared. Beatrice had said she knew that, and there was that thing between what he had said and what she had answered that neither needed to expand upon, that was whole just like that. And then the second summer arrived, December of 1932. A year and a half after Beatrice had arrived in that town with the worn leather suitcase and the heavy iron key and the quiet determination that makes no noise. The Sycamore house was different in a way that was not just repaired walls and open windows and a solid roof. It was different in the way houses become when someone who belongs to them has finally arrived. It was alive. It was inhabited from the inside out. It was the kind of place people pass by on the street and look at not out of curiosity, but out of that specific pleasure of seeing something functioning well. The studio had a month-long waiting list. The yard produced more than one person needed, and the excess went to the little box at the gate, or to Mrs. Rose, or to anyone who needed it. The oak shelf in the studio was full of fabrics organized by color and texture. The rose bushes had gone through their second bloom of the year and had new buds arriving, and on a December afternoon of rain that had arrived early and ended early, Lucas arrived at the Sycamore house with his day's work finished earlier than expected and found Beatrice on the front porch, sewing a fine stitch on a silk fabric she was making for an order, with the kerosene lamp lit beside her because the rain had left the afternoon darker than usual. He sat in the other wicker chair. He sat in silence for a moment of the kind that was familiar between the two, of the kind that did not need filling. Then he said, with that directness he had learned from her over a year and a half, that there was a thing he wanted to ask, that he had thought a lot before asking, not because he had doubts, but because he wanted to be certain that the words were right for the thing it was. Beatrice lowered her sewing and looked at him. Lucas said that he had come to a conclusion over all this time, that he had lived in this town his whole life and had never felt there was a specific place he wanted to reach. Not in the way some people know early on what their place in the world is, with that clarity he had always envied in others and never felt in himself, but that over the last 18 months he had realized he was arriving somewhere. Not a physical place exactly, although that porch, that house, that street were part of it. It was a place that had more to do with who was by his side. He made a pause that was short but held weight. He said he wanted to know if she wanted the side to be permanent, that he wanted to know if she wanted to build with him in the same way she had built that house, slowly and with care and with the certainty that what was going to stay was being made right. The rain had stopped completely, and the air had that clean freshness of after a summer rain, and the sycamore trees on Cedar Street were dripping from their leaves, and the sun was returning on the horizon, and there was a low, wide rainbow that went from one sycamore to another over the street, the kind of thing you do not ask for, but that appears when the moment is this one. Beatrice sat looking at Lucas for a moment that was meant for feeling the whole thing, for knowing the answer before saying it, and for wanting to say it the right way. Then she said that she had arrived in that town with a list of things that needed to be done, and had done them one by one, that she had learned the house is the thing you build with what you have, with your hands, and with your time, and with your presence. That she had learned this with the Sycamore house, and that she had learned it with him too, with every week, with every afternoon on the porch, with every time he had shown up when she needed someone, and with every time he had shown up when she did not need anything except for him to be there. She said yes, with that same direct voice that was her way for everything, with open eyes and without ceremony and with all the certainty she had built over that time. She said yes. Lucas went quiet for a second, that was for receiving that with the care it deserved. Then he covered her hand, which still held the sewing, with his hand, with that gentle firmness that was the way of everything he did. The two stayed like that for a moment on the front porch, with the rainbow in the sycamores and the smell of rain and earth and the returning sun. And there was a quietness around them that was the kind that happens when something that was arriving has arrived. In the years that followed, Silent Valley was witness to many things that belonged to a small town and an honest life, and a love made in the everyday, which is the most lasting kind. The Sycamore House gained over time that specific appearance of a place that was loved, not the perfection of a new thing, but the dignity of a cared-for thing. The facade was repainted once every few years, always in white with the windows in dark green, which had been discovered as the original color when Beatrice carefully scraped the old frame of the main door. The windows remained open on sunny mornings and breezy afternoons every year without exception. The sewing studio grew along with Beatrice's reputation, which was the reputation of someone who does the promised work in the promised time for the promised price, which is the complete equation of any business that lasts. Women from neighboring towns began to make the bus trip to Silent Valley specifically for the studio, which was the kind of notoriety a small town receives with the specific pride of someone who did not expect it, but who appreciates it. Lucas Moretti's carpentry shop grew larger, taking over the space next door that had become available when the cobbler retired, and gained a helper besides Tommy, who had gotten married and who came to work humming as always, with the difference that now the melody was sometimes from a radio song his wife had taught him. And that house at the end of Cedar Street, which had expelled 7 families in 20 years, came to be spoken of in the town in a way different from how it had been spoken of before, no longer as a cursed place or as an unsolved mystery. It came to be told as proof of something, although the townspeople described this proof in slightly different ways depending on who was telling it. Mr. Ernest, who had become a much bigger part of the history of that house than was evident from afar, would say, to anyone who asked with that direct and brief vocabulary that was his way, that the thing was simple. The house had waited for someone who was not afraid of work. Mrs. Rose, who had the gift of finding the phrase that stuck, said on an afternoon of conversation at the boarding house that the house had been like everything that seems impossible. It only needed someone who did not read the impossible sign on the door and simply walked in. Mr. Bennett, the clerk, who had witnessed the entire conversation with that expression of someone calculating the legal value of poetry, said that from the point of view of the documents the matter was simple. There was a property, there was a buyer, there was a transaction registered at the clerk's office. The rest was up to the parties. And Mrs. Clementine, who had taken longer than she should have but had gotten there, said it in a way that carried the honesty of a person who changed her mind, and who is not small enough to pretend she did not change it, that she had bet wrong, and that she had rarely been so happy to be wrong. But the version that remained was the one Beatrice told when someone asked, which was less frequently than people imagine, because she was not one to tell stories about herself without a reason. When they asked, she said simply and directly that she had arrived at a house that the world had decided was impossible, and that she had opened the windows, and that the rest had happened on its own. That sometimes the most revolutionary act there is simply not leaving when everything tells you to go. And the Sycamore House stood at the end of Cedar Street with its windows always open, with the rose bushes blooming in the front bed, with the sunflowers in the backyard always turned toward the sun, with the smell of coffee and worked wood and Thursday bread, which were the smell of that place, and which anyone passing by the street recognized from afar as the smell of a house that had people inside who wanted to be there. And from time to time, on weekend afternoons when work had stopped and the sun was going down, and the sycamores on the street cast that generous shade of an old tree, there were two people sitting on the front porch in the wicker chairs Mr. Ernest had given, one with a mug of coffee and the other with sewing or a book, and there was between them that silence of people who are where they want to be, who need nothing more from the moment than the moment itself. And the windows of the sycamore house were open, as always, as since the first day.